Scott Russell Sanders is the author of 20 books of fiction and nonfiction, including Hunting for Hope and A Conservationist Manifesto. His most recent books are Earthworks, Selected Essays, from 2012, and Divine Animal, a novel, published in 2014. Among his honors are the Lannan Literary Award, the John Burroughs Essay Award, the Mark Twain Award, the Cecil Woods Award for Nonfiction, the Eugene and Marilyn Glick Indiana Authors Award, and fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts. In 2012, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. He is a distinguished professor emeritus of English at Indiana University. Sanders' writing is driven by a careful attention to place, a reverence for the beauty of the world and the beings that surround him. His themes include, in his own words, our place in nature, our murderous and ingenious technology, the possibilities of community, love and strife within families, and the search for a spiritual ground. His writing is both compassionate and revelatory, driven by deeply human questions and a desire to articulate a shared world. He and his wife, Ruth, a biochemist, have reared 2 children in their hometown of Bloomington in the hardwood hill country of Indiana's White River Valley. Please join me in welcoming Scott Russell Sanders.
Thank you. Thank you to everyone here. Thanks to John Binion, who brought me to BYU and has graciously hosted me for the last 2 days. They may have seemed like a week to John or a month to John because he's had so much time and so many tasks associated with my visit, but I'm very grateful to him. I'm grateful to Michael for inviting me to take part in this series, and to Zach for making arrangements before my coming, and for that gracious introduction. What I'm going to read to you is a story called Clear Cut from a book that was a book of mine, book of short stories published in August, this past August. So it's a new book, but the stories are fairly old, and they're what the trade calls science fiction. My preferred title is What If Fiction. I write realistic fiction. In fact, I'll mention to the fiction readers among you the novel that was referred to that came out in 2014 called Divine Animal is available free as an ebook at my website. If you log into scottrussellsanders.com on the homepage, you can download Divine Animal for Kindle or for every other kind of reading device. You're not tracked. They don't count it. I don't know your email address, and certainly it's free. So if you want to sample the book, Divine Animal, just scottrussellsanders.com, and you'll find it right there on the homepage. That's a realistic novel set in the United States during the 2000s. Dancing in Dreamtime, the book that came out in August, is a collection of stories that are set either on Earth in the future, a few decades, century or so in the future, or on other Earth-like planets, or in our contemporary world with some aspect of that contemporary world slightly askew. That's why I call them what-if stories. What if a planet were conscious? So there's a story that follows out that question. What if shamans from various indigenous cultures could orbit in something like a space shuttle and perform rituals that would heal human divisions and environmental ecological disruptions on our planet? What if? And then so I write a story playing out that. So this is a what if story. It's set in a recognizably contemporary world. I hope it's recognizably contemporary. But some aspect of that world, as you will soon see, is different from the way we think about our world. The man who sat down next to Veronica on a park bench one April morning turned to her and said, "Have you noticed there aren't nearly so many dreams around anymore?" He was about her age, mid-20s, bearded, bespectable, bespectacled, thin as a bird's wing with the secretive air of a spy. And the dreams that do come, he added, are so threadbare you can see right through them. When Veronica merely studied the black scuffed toes of her nurse's clogs without replying, the man leaned toward her and confided, "It comes from cutting down the old forest. There aren't enough places for dreams to roost in the daytime. I can remember when this whole ridge was covered in trees." Ordinarily, when a strange man addressed her, Veronica either ignored him until he fell silent, or else, if he persisted, she glared at him and walked swiftly away. But she was intrigued by what this stranger said and reassured by his shyness. Accustomed to being stared at by men, she found it refreshing that he peered through his metal-rimmed glasses in every direction except hers. "Yes," she said. "From the fire tower, you could see trees all the way to the horizon." The man nodded agreement with a wag of his chin. Veronica gripped the edge of the bench to keep her hands from trembling, wondering if she had finally met a kindred soul. Although she did nothing to enhance what nature had blessed her with, neither padding nor painting, wherever Veronica went, men flung after her the lassos of their gaze. They saw in her wavy auburn hair and rosy complexion promises of offspring and delight. Her swaying walk set their hearts racing. Had they been moose or bison, they would have battered one another to win her favor. Since they were human, they asked her out on dates. But Veronica found her suitors to be drearily predictable, passionate only about money or sex, and perhaps with milder interest in cars or golf, without an ounce of imagination. Their idea of high adventure was to try a new restaurant or to shift the asset allocations in their portfolios. One after another, she told them no, 1,000 times no. "You won't bloom forever," her mother warned. "One day the bees will stop buzzing around." "Then I won't get stung," Veronica thought. "Would a doctor be such a bad catch?" her father asked. Caught like a cold, she thought, or like plague? She bit her tongue and let her parents nag, for how could they know what she longed for, when she had only the vaguest notion herself? She chose to work the graveyard shift in the emergency ward because at night there were fewer doctors around to pat and pinch and ogle her. The bleary-eyed interns only gave her speculative stares as if they were studying the menu but too tired to eat. The male nurses had learned to fear her wrath. Night was the prime time for accidents and mayhem, as if people took leave of their senses with the onset of darkness. Husbands beat up their wives. Mothers with nerves rubbed raw by bawling infants took too many pills. Toddlers swallowed paper clips or mothballs or keys. Teenagers tried uppers or downers, sliced their arms with razor blades, wrecked their cars. Drunks tripped on curbs and broke bones. Muggers worked the sidewalks. Car thieves worked the streets. Rival gangs fought over turf with guns or knives. During the graveyard shift, wave after wave of sirens rushed toward the emergency room like storm-driven surf. "It beats me why you keep working nights," her father said, in the tone of baffled affection he had used toward Veronica since her adolescent blossoming. "You've got enough money to work afternoons, maybe even straight days." "Don't hide your light under a bushel," said her mother. "Those surgeons you work with can earn $1,000 with a few flicks of a scalpel," her father said, "and you won't give them the time of day." "You are so often asleep when your beaux call, I have to convince them you aren't sick," her mother complained. They aren't my beaux, Veronica said. They're just men pestering me. Her mother sighed. You're punishing us, aren't you? As if it's our fault. You're gorgeous. Okay, her father conceded. Maybe all the doctors are creeps, but there's other fish in the sea, right? What about that vice president from the bank, or the bowling alley magnate, or the tech entrepreneur, or the contractor who builds pizza franchises? Those are decent guys, and they're rolling in dough. Snag a husband while you can, her mother advised. Do you want to be a night shift nurse for the rest of your life? The answer to that question was no. Veronica did not want to be any sort of nurse forever. She was already nearing burnout from dealing with broken, bleeding, desperate people, but she could not decide what else to do with her life. No matter what path she envisioned, teaching, forestry, market gardening, graphic design, it led through a gauntlet of men. They would be her bosses, her colleagues, her students, her customers, until her accidental beauty faded. They would value nothing else about her. With their rudimentary drives, men seemed to her a separate species trapped in an evolutionary cul-de-sac like plankton or horseshoe crabs, while women had evolved to higher levels of complexity. For the present, Veronica stuck with her midnight shift despite the stress and gore. After supper, she changed into her navy blue scrubs and sturdy clogs. Although her jacket and pants were a couple of sizes too large, chosen to fit loosely, when she arrived at the hospital, men would still gawk at her. She always arrived early and parked her car at the edge of a lot near a stand of big trees, mostly beeches and maples and oaks, the last survivors of an ancient forest that once covered the ridge now occupied by the hospital. From this vantage point, she could see skeins of street lights stretching along the three rivers that converged at the heart of the city, the flashing red beacons atop bridges, the glare of blast furnaces, the jets of yellow flame above refineries, and steam drifting in luminous clouds above the mills. But her chief pleasure was to watch the dream creatures stir from their roosts in the high branches and go gliding down to haunt the bedrooms of sleepers. Once she clocked in for work, time passed quickly in a siege of heart attacks, gunshot wounds, diabetic seizures, broken legs, collapsed lungs, third-degree burns, and sundry other afflictions, all accompanied by cries of pain. Among the few patients who lifted her spirits were the expectant mothers, too far along to reach the maternity ward, who staggered in and delivered their babies on a gurney, sometimes into Veronica's gloved hands. During the rare lulls between emergencies, she wrote lists in a small notebook she kept in her pocket. Lists of proverbs, vegetables, rivers, constellations, titles of books, women scientists, famous painters, obscure actors, songs, lists of anything she could dredge up from her brain. Noticing her list-keeping habit, one of the gawkers might ask, "What are you scribbling, baby doll?" "Poetry," she might answer, to discourage the man, or letters to a crazed world. Indeed, as the world sank into disarray, she would have written poetry if she knew how, but at least she could make little havens of order by writing lists. Veronica's favorite moment arrived after she clocked out at dawn. In cold weather, she sat in her car and gazed down at the incandescent city. In mild weather, she watched from a bench under the creamy branches of a giant sycamore tree. As alarm clocks rang and sleepers awoke, dream creatures slipped away from bedsides and came wafting up out of the valley to roost in the old trees beside the parking lot. They filled every branch, crammed together cheek by jowl. Judging by their gaudy outfits, they might have been a flock of parrots, yet they made little noise, only a dry rustling like wind in leaves. The sound enchanted Veronica, who imagined they were exchanging notes about the dreams they had performed for sleepers in the city. Of course, dreams were also needed in daytime, though not so many, for napping babies and drowsy old folks and dozing workers home from the graveyard shift. On mornings when Veronica sat watching the flocks of characters returning to the ridge, a smaller number rose from the treetops where they had been roosting and swooped down into the city. Occasionally she would meet in her dreams some dragon or soldier or crone whom she had seen gliding away on this daytime journey. Back in her childhood, when the ridge was still part of a state forest, Veronica often came here with her parents to picnic or camp. At first she had been frightened by the flying specters with their talons and fangs, their metal hooks for hands and barbed tails and tentacles. When she pointed them out with a shudder, her parents dismissed her worries. "Monsters in the trees," her mother echoed teasingly. "Let's have a look," her father said, shining his flashlight into the branches. The beam swept over a white-bearded gnome, a scarlet devil, and a burly gorilla, all clear as day to Veronica. But her father merely said, "See there, kiddo, just empty trees, nothing to worry your pretty head about." She soon lost her fear of the creatures and never again mentioned them to her parents. From the first, she knew perfectly well what they were, these goblins and ghouls, these shaggy wolves, these hunchbacks and witches and mad scientists. Some she recognized from her own dreams, especially the nightmarish beasts, while others, the hunter, the wizard, the drowned sailor, others appeared in dreams recounted by her friends. It seemed reasonable to her as a child that these nighttime visitors would spend the daylight hours roosting in trees like owls. Back in those years before puberty, when girls still looked at her without jealousy and boys without lust, she would hike up to the forested ridge with friends at dawn or dusk to see if they noticed the specters swirling overhead. Only one of those friends, a languid boy with sunken cheeks and forehead pasted with sweaty hair, ever seemed aware of the chattering flocks. "Do you hear that?" he said to her one night. "Hear what?" she asked hopefully. "That whispery sound," he said, "like river rapids far away." Another evening he squinted up into the bustling air and observed, "The sky is full of colored patches." "What shape are they?" she asked. "I can't make them out," he said. "They keep shifting like jewels in a kaleidoscope." Soon afterward, the boy took to his bed and died of leukemia, leaving Veronica alone with her visions. And so when the bearded stranger sat down next to her on the bench one April morning and said with a secretive air, "Have you noticed there aren't nearly so many dreams these days?" Veronica neither glared at him nor fled. Instead, she gripped the edge of the bench to still her trembling and waited to hear what he would say next. He recalled the hardwood forest that once covered this ridge where the hospital now sprawled, and parking lots and amid parking lots and landscaped grounds. And then she recalled how, as a girl, she would climb the fire tower and gaze with wonder over a sea of trees. Of course, the tower had long since been taken down, together with all but a scattering of trees that were spared to provide islands of shade on the groomed lawns of the hospital. "The city keeps on expanding," the man said, waving a bony hand at the horizon. Any day you can hear chainsaws and bulldozers leveling another woods. It's worrisome, said Veronica. She stole a glance at the man, so pale and thin, his hair and sparse beard as blonde as corn silk, his blue eyes glinting behind the spectacles like pebbles at the bottom of a creek, shyly avoided looking at her. The fewer the trees, the fewer the dreams, the man went on. Some people get only half a sleep's worth. Others don't get any. That's why the hospital is so busy. That's why the city is boiling with anger and fear. People are going nuts from dream deprivation. Veronica had been disturbed by the same thought and was about to tell him so. But before she could speak, she burst out laughing, overjoyed to meet someone who shared her vision. Abruptly, the man stood up. I didn't mean to bother you. Oh, you're not bothering me. You're laughing. You probably think I'm weird. No, no. His scrawny frame swayed as if caught by a breeze. From the way you were watching the skies, I thought maybe you saw. Without finishing his sentence, he bolted for his car. Veronica rose from the bench and called after him, Wait! But without looking back, he hurried on to a mud-splattered jeep, climbed in, and drove away. As the engine noise receded, she could hear the chatter of flocks rising from the ancient trees to go deliver daytime dreams. That night, as usual, Veronica arrived early for work, and the next morning she lingered afterwards. Instead of going to the bench under the huge sycamore, however, she sat in her car to watch the flurry of dream characters arriving and departing, aware of the bearded man sitting nearby in his jeep. They kept on like that for several days, cooped up in their cars. Then one morning she walked to the parking lot after a hectic graveyard shift, the food in her cooler bag still untouched, and there he was, standing at the base of the sycamore, hands pressed against the trunk, gazing up through the branches where new leaves blazed like tiny green flames. Curious to see him touching her favorite tree, she continued on past her car and onto the lawn, drinking in the fragrant spring air. Eventually, as if by chance, she circled back to the bench and sat down, placing the bag beside her on the weathered slats. With eyes closed, the man was embracing the great tree, his cheek against the massive trunk, his arms reaching perhaps a quarter of the way around. As if sensing her presence, he suddenly opened his eyes and stood back, brushing flakes of bark from his jacket. I like trees, he said apologetically. I love them, said Veronica, especially this one with its patchwork bark and creamy branches. It's like a dancing goddess with 100 arms. Yes, said the man, a dancing goddess. His beard parted with a smile. Gesturing at the bench, he asked, Do you mind? By way of answer, she picked up the bag and placed it on her lap. He lowered himself beside her, not too close, and kept his legs cocked as if ready to flee. I didn't mean to spook you the other day. You didn't spook me. She hesitated, then decided to take a chance. I see them too. He gave her a startled look, his eyes wide behind their lenses. What do you see? She tilted her face toward the brightening sky and pointed. There's a fox, a fat lady, a burglar, a tangle of snakes, a dwarf. And a peacock, he said, grinning broadly now. An octopus, a two-headed calf, a gambler in a green eye shade, a lumberjack, a tattooed woman, a beggar with a bowl, a child in a lab coat. They fell silent and stared at one another. His eyes watered, and Veronica could feel tears brimming from her own. After several deep breaths, she asked, Have you seen them all before? He nodded. All of them. I've cataloged several hundred characters, but I haven't added any new ones for years. In fact, lots of those on my list don't show up anymore. I've noticed that. Many old standbys are disappearing. I suspect they're migrating, searching for a forest that hasn't been clear-cut, he said, finishing her thought. That's why our city is suffering a drought of dreams. Exactly. Veronica shivered. It was as if she had finally met someone who spoke her native tongue. I've always wondered where the dream furnishings are kept. You know, bulky things like rockets and cupboards, or scenery like mountains and castles and caves. I've wondered too, he said. Maybe they're dissolved in the air of the bedrooms and only precipitate out when they're needed for a dream. So that's why if you sleep in somebody else's house or a hotel or in a tent, she began, the scenery and props are different from the ones at home. No longer pallid, his face shone, and Veronica's own cheeks burned. She squeezed the cooler bag with both hands to keep from reaching over to stroke his downy beard out of sheer gratitude. No man, except her father, had ever made her feel so safe, and even her father had never made her feel so deeply understood. While the chatter from the trees ebbed into silence and the sky turned from pink to blue, they sat there trading stories. His name was Martin. He was an X-ray technician at the hospital. Starved of dreams, he had recently volunteered for the night shift so he could sleep in the daytime when the characters might be more convincing and the plots fresher. Living alone since his parents had retired to a golf course condo in Arizona, he taped notes on the refrigerator to remind himself to eat. As a boy, he had wanted to become a painter, but his parents refused to pay for art school, insisting that he learn a practical skill, and he gave in, studying X-ray technology at the community college. Now, after 4 years of capturing ghostly images of bones, he was beginning to doubt the substantiality of flesh. When I saw you sitting there on the bench, Martin said, at first I thought you were a figment from dreams, but when I looked closer, I saw you were real. How could you tell? Your curiosity, your excitement, the intense way you watched the sky, I could almost see the rays cast by your eyes like searchlights. Veronica remembered the beam of her father's flashlight shining up through the branches and his assurance that nothing was there. When you sat down beside me that first morning, she said, you didn't seem very substantial yourself. You made me think of birds with gauzy wings and hollow bones. Birds, he muttered, then snapped his fingers and drew a notebook from his pocket and jotted something down. Excuse me, I just remembered the name of a constellation. Cygnus the Swan? How did you know? Veronica smiled. I've made a list of constellations. You keep lists? Lots of them. She produced her own notebook and riffled the pages with her thumb. There's something I can hold on to while the world's spinning out of control. Amazing, he said. It's as if we're twins. He ran his gaze over her head to toe lightly, then blushed and looked away. Not identical twins, of course. She laughed. No, not identical. Gripped once more by shyness, Martin stood up and squinted at the sky. Looks like the show is over for this morning. Time to go sleep. Maybe we'll see one another here again. I hope so, said Veronica. Back home that morning, she received the customary grilling from her parents, who wanted to know if she had met any cute doctors at the hospital, and would she please return calls from the banker and bowling alley magnate, and why doesn't she buy some pastel outfits for work instead of navy blue? Pink would bring out your lovely coloring, her mother said. As soon as she could disentangle herself, Veronica filled the bathtub and soaked neck deep in the steaming water and fell asleep. She dreamed of spiders spinning webs between the stars to snare comets and spaceships. It was a familiar scenario. interesting the first time, grown tedious through repetition. The spiders seemed as bored with their work as the orderlies at the hospital. She was entering a second dream, this one about a flying man, not brawny Daedalus with his wings of wax melted by the sun, but a slender man with a blond beard and blue eyes, wheeling in thermals above a forested ridge. When a knock rattled the door and her mother barged in carrying a pizza that filled the bathroom with the smell of pepperoni. "It's from that contractor," her mother announced. "He delivered it himself. He said he'd bring one every week, except he doesn't want to spoil your perfect figure. Isn't that sweet?" Veronica groaned. "I can't eat it. I'm vegetarian." "Since when?" "Since right now. I just converted." Her mother frowned. "What are we going to do with you?" "You can start, Mother, by taking that pizza out of here and letting me dry off. This water is cold." As Veronica rose from the tub, her mother surveyed her up and down and repeated a favorite remark. "You could pose for statues." A museum specimen was what Veronica felt like much of the time, or a zoo animal, as if she were an exhibit rather than a person. But just now, buffing herself with a towel, she recalled the secretive turns of Martin's voice and felt warmth spreading through her body. The two of them began arriving earlier for work in the evenings and departing later in the mornings. In dry weather, they sat on the bench under the sycamore. In wet, they huddled in Martin's Jeep, shivering with pleasure at the sound of rain on the roof. Thunder and lightning pleased them even more. He did not kiss her or touch her before asking, and well before he asked, she was ready to be kissed or touched. Holding one another, they felt less need for keeping lists. Martin rarely brought much to eat during his shift and often forgot to bring anything at all. So Veronica began carrying extra food in her cooler: boiled eggs, walnuts, apples, turkey slices, blueberry muffins, yogurt, quiche. All these and more she offered him, and he ate obediently. Before long, the shadows vanished from his cheeks, his limbs filled out, and his skin took on an earthly glow. "You'll ruin your figure," her mother cautioned one afternoon when she noticed Veronica packing so much food. Instead of bristling, Veronica mildly explained, "I'm taking extra for a friend at work." "What sort of friend?" "Human." Her mother snorted. "You know what I mean. Man or woman, young or old?" "A young man." "Tony!" Her mother yelled into the den where the TV was erupting with sounds of gunshots. "Come listen to this." Veronica's father shuffled into the kitchen, groggy from the tube. "Listen to what?" "Our girl has a boyfriend at work." Her father suddenly came alert. "Is it that brain surgeon who keeps calling?" "No, Daddy." "The cardiologist?" her mother asked. "Not the cardiologist," Veronica said patiently. "He's an X-ray technician." Her father whistled. "A radiologist?" "No, he only takes the pictures. But he has a college degree and a wonderful mind and the kindest eyes." Her parents exchanged a look that lasted several seconds, long enough for them to arrive at some realization that made them smile. They turned their beaming faces to her. "If you found your guy, Ronnie," said her father, running a hand softly over her hair as he used to do when she was little, "then bless you, sweetheart. All we ask is that you don't move in with him until you've got a ring. And it wouldn't hurt to keep him interested by wearing some lipstick and eyeliner and clothes that show off your figure," her mother added. Without resorting to makeup or changing her wardrobe, Veronica became, if anything, even more alluring. In the corridors of the hospital, men interrupted their errands to watch her pass. Male doctors would sometimes look up from a patient to issue a command, snag their gaze on her, and forget what they meant to say. Female doctors no longer scowled at her as if she were seeking attention, but accepted her as another example of nature's prodigal beauty, like butterflies or waterfalls or the aurora borealis. Several times each night, Martin slipped into the emergency room to deliver x-rays from one or another victim, casting a glance at Veronica that set her nerves tingling. There was never time for more than a glance, because the number of victims kept swelling as woodlands around the city were cleared. Bored with flimsy dreams and fangless nightmares, or deprived of dreams altogether, sleepers awoke feeling muddled and furious. There were wildcat strikes at factories along the river, explosions at the refinery, bomb threats in the courthouse, lockdowns in schools. Knife fights broke out on playgrounds, fist fights in public hearings. Turf wars erupted in the suburbs. Policemen pepper-sprayed anyone who gave them lip. A homeless encampment under one of the bridges was set on fire. The reek of tear gas and smoke hung over the city. The emergency ward overflowed with bruised children and battered women, wounded teenagers, confused elders, zonked out druggies, failed suicides, mangled survivors of car crashes, sufferers of heart attacks or strokes, a procession of shattered and bleeding, shrieking and moaning souls. Following their shift, Veronica and Martin would collapse onto the bench under the great sycamore, almost too exhausted to talk. When they broke the silence, it was often to complain of their shabby dreams, which no longer aroused them, no longer scared or inspired them. The wizards and crones lacked wisdom. The stormtroopers and demons lacked menace. The saints and bodhisattvas lacked conviction. The specters that still roosted in the big trees atop the ridge were tattered like letters that had been folded and refolded too many times. Their chatter was drowned out by the clangor of fire engines and squad cars and ambulances. As spring gave way to summer, sweltering heat increased the turmoil. Loaded gurneys filled the hallways of the hospital, and then the lobby, and then the cafeteria. In August, the hospital board announced plans to double the capacity of the emergency facilities by adding a wing, and to do so with all possible speed. Within days, the site of the new construction was marked by red survey flags, a large rectangle that enclosed the bench, the great sycamore, and the entire grove of old trees. The trunk of each doomed tree was encircled by a strip of orange tape. Men wearing hard hats and fluorescent green overalls arrived one morning as Veronica and Martin were leaving the hospital, wrung out from the siege of patients during graveyard shift. Two of the men picked up the bench and moved it to a patch of grass far from the sycamore, so the lovers took refuge in Martin's Jeep. They stared glumly through the windshield as a truck pulled up hauling a bulldozer, which the men in day-glow overalls set about unloading. Chainsaws began to snarl. "This is going to finish things off," Martin said quietly. "There's no future here," said Veronica. They stayed long enough to watch several of the big trees come down, the huge trunks and branches gouging the dirt and sending out shock waves the lovers could feel in their bones. The few returning dream creatures swirled in the air above the spots where the crowns of the trees used to be. The specters circled higher and higher, as if bewildered, and then set off toward the horizon, dwindling away like brightly colored leaves riding the wind. The bulldozer roared back and forth, tearing out stumps. When the teeth of a chainsaw began ripping into the trunk of the sycamore, Veronica whispered, "Take me to your place," and Martin started the Jeep. She took the first shower, leaving her drab clothes like a discarded chrysalis on a chair in his bedroom. Then while Martin showered, she waited in his bed. When he joined her there, smelling of mint shampoo, he spread her damp hair on the pillow, an auburn fan, and kissed her forehead, then her lips. The tremors she felt as his hands grazed her body were like those from the falling of the great trees. They lay with their limbs entwined through the daylight hours, wakeful, whispering, unvisited by dreams. Then all through the following night and all the days and nights thereafter, the city rattled with gunfire and boomed with explosions, and sirens never stopped wailing. That's it. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. So we have about 7 minutes for questions, comments. I know I need to let folks go at 12:50 because some people have 1 o'clock appointments. But those who want to talk, I'll be, of course, be in the reception afterwards and be glad to talk with you there. But people have questions or comments? Yes.
I teach Introduction to Creative Writing, and students often want to write sci-fi or what-if fiction. And they often are thwarted in their desires by the cliches that they're surrounded by in pop culture, and they end up writing derivative fiction at best. So how do you approach students like that? How do you take, well, what you just did there was wonderful, and the kind of work I would love to see my students do. How do you encourage students to think about what if fiction outside of the derivative forms?
Yeah. The question from Joey is, when one's, as a teacher, and there are many teachers in the room, including I know a lot of graduate students who are teaching, when you have a student who's interested in writing genre fiction, which could be horror fiction, could be science fiction, could be fantasy, and other kinds of genre fiction, often they've read so much within the genre that they've picked up all the cliches and stereotypes and conventions of that genre, and it's often hard for them to get outside those conventions. And of course, as in any art form, if you just reproduce the stereotypes, it's very rare to produce anything new or interesting, even to the writer, new to the writer, fresh to the writer. And as Flannery O'Connor said, no surprise in the writer, no surprise in the reader. If you don't feel a sense of discovery in your writing, your reader's almost certainly not going to feel a sense of freshness and discovery in the reading experience. Well, I often will point somebody, say someone who's interested in science fiction, and they're full of clanking robots or alien invasions or whatever conventions that they are patterning. I'll give them, or I'll say, go read Italo Calvino, who's a wonderful Italian speculative writer, or go read Jorge Luis Borges, or go read, so I'll send them to people who write fiction that's not straight up realistic fiction. It's often very strange fiction, but it helps them to think, okay, you don't have to write realistic fiction, there's all kinds of fiction, but if you're going to write non-realistic fiction, don't just do it in a stereotypical way. So the main thing I do, Joey, is to point them to writers who are doing it in interesting ways. Mind you, there are people whose work is marketed as science fiction or fantasy who are marvelous writers. And this book Dancing, that I just read from, Dancing in Dreamtime, is dedicated to Ursula Le Guin, who's a longtime friend and just a hero to me, a marvelous, marvelous writer. And her books have been sold and celebrated as science fiction fantasy, and they're great. They're as good as any contemporary literature. So there are people within the genre. That's the other thing. If one knows the genre well enough, you can point them to people within the genre who are really doing fresh and original things. Yes?
So I am an environmental humanities major, and I'm interested in just the way that humans interact with the environment, kind of the dichotomy of man versus nature. And so I'm curious, when you were writing this short story, did you start out with almost wanting to make like a political statement about environmentalism, or did you more start out wanting to write a science fiction story and those themes were surfaced as you went on?
Well, certainly, I better get here. So the question is, did I set out wanting to deliver an environmental message, or did I set out trying to write a what-if story? It's always, the writers in the audience would appreciate it. It's always hard, often hard, to recall the germ, the seed, something that set it in motion. But I think in this case, it was just, it was a sense that the destruction of the natural world the disruption and the degradation of the natural world, the greater than human world, is making us crazy. I believe that's literally true. It is, I think, in proportion as we cut ourselves off from the greater web of life and damage it and in some degree destroy it, we're not only jeopardizing our physical survival, I think we're jeopardizing our mental health. We live in a society where addiction of every sort, alcohol, opiate, drug addiction, is rampant. We have the highest level of use of barbiturates and tranquilizers and mood altering medicines. We have chronic insomnia, and people take sleep medicine, and then they take uppers to wake themselves up. And we live in a society which has a tremendous amount of mental illness in it. And there are a lot of factors. I don't say it's just the destruction of nature and the separation from nature that drive that. So I carry that awareness. So the story's thesis, if you will, and so if one wants to reduce it like in a student theme, what's the theme of this story? What's the thesis of this story? It's that the destruction of the natural world causes psychological damage to us, as well as, of course, physical jeopardy. It jeopardizes our survival physically. And I believe that's literally true. So I carry that awareness. So I didn't discover that in the course of writing the story, but I did discover in the story, in many ways it's a conventional love story, he, she. Guy sits down next to the bench, and he's an exception to the kinds of males who kind of predatory, one-dimensional males that this woman has encountered up to that time in her life. And so at one level, it's a love story, but it's also a story of two people who see the world askew. They see it in a way that's not the normal way to see the world, the way her father sees it, the way everybody else sees it. And in finding one another, they realize that they're not alone. They're not unique. They're not crazy. They actually share with another human being that quality of vision. And that interested me in the story, and that emerged in the course of the story. I don't think there was one factor that set the story in motion, and that would be true, I would say, the other, I think there are 22 stories in the book. I think that would be true of other stories. And they're all quite different, one to another, but they all have that quality of, well, what if it were the case that the characters that we encounter in dreams literally had to roost somewhere when they weren't in our heads? What would happen if the places where they roosted were destroyed? What would happen to our dreams? And when our dreams are disrupted, what happens to our days? And when our cities are disrupted, as of course they are, not just by this, by poverty, by lots of things. When our cities are disrupted, what are our lives going to be like? So there's a chain of questions. I think I can take one more, and then again, I'm happy to talk individually with people. Yes?
So this is kind of like the flip side to Professor Franklin's question. What would you say to, so I'm a creative writing student, and I really enjoy genre fiction, literary fiction, things like that. But it often feels like when I'm writing in a university setting, I'm surrounded by people who are familiar with the conventions of realistic fiction, but not so much the conventions of genre fiction. How do you go about writing something that it sees the world askew? How do you write it in such a way that it still communicates the emotion you want to people who aren't maybe as familiar with the archetype that you're working in?
Well, I'll try to summarize that. I think the short way of saying it, and correct me if I'm not being fair to your question, because the question I'm going to articulate I've often encountered in students. If one wants to write genre fiction as opposed to realistic fiction, and you're in a graduate writing or undergraduate writing workshop, and everybody else in the workshop is writing realistic fiction, and maybe that everybody else is predisposed to think of genre fiction as junk. What do you do? Well, it's easy to say what I'm about to say. One thing is, if you write something really good, it'll help them to see that literature is more varied and there are more dimensions, potential dimensions to fiction than they're accustomed to. And that's a good thing for them, to learn that, because there's a great deal of stuff out there that would enrich their lives as readers and also enrich their writing if they were more acquainted with it. So if you can write well enough, you know, to some extent you can break through that. But I think one ought to follow one's passion as a writer. In other words, if that's really what moves you, a certain kind of genre writing, that's what you ought to try writing. You may have to have conversations with classmates, often with teachers. Teachers can have very narrow aesthetics as well. I doubt that's true here, but you know, it's possible. Teachers can have very fixed aesthetics, and anything outside that range, they kind of think, well, that can't be any good because it's not within my aesthetic. So that can be a problem too, and just have conversations. In any good writing program, and I know there's a good one here, undergraduate and graduate, you're going to learn more from your peers than you learn from your teachers. You don't realize that now. You may be very grateful to your teachers. Learning from your teachers, you're clearly going to learn a lot from your teachers. But in the long run, you're going to learn more from your peers. And one of the things you're going to learn is the variety of ways in which your art form can be made, because your peers are practicing a much wider range of writing, whatever it is, nonfiction, fiction, poetry, than your teacher is. All your teachers are writers themselves, but your classmates, there's this bigger spectrum of writing. So your classmates are going to learn from you things that they couldn't learn from your teacher, in all likelihood. And you're going to learn from them books that they're reading or things they do in their fiction that will apply to the kind of fiction you write. So yeah, it can be a practical problem, and sometimes it can be demoralizing to feel that you're this oddball, in a class where everybody else seems to be doing a similar kind of thing, and you want to do a different kind of thing. But also when you realize that you may be a resource for them. Your writing and books, why don't you go read so-and-so? And they sample it and say, oh, so-and-so is pretty interesting. Never even read this kind of thing before. So it could be a resource. I need to let you go, and I'll be glad to talk with anybody. You don't need to buy a book to talk with me. You can talk with me. But if you do want a book, I'll be happy to sign it, of course. But thanks so much for your...